welcome everyone. My name is Rebecca Snyder and I'm the Executive Director of the Maryland-Delaware DC Press Association. And we are here today because Maryland is poised to override a veto of House Bill 732, which would institute really a devastating digital ad tax in the state. And so I'm joined today by Tim Nelson, who's the counsel to the Maryland-Delaware DC broadcasters, and Beth Cyphers, who's the VP of Media Works, which is a media agency in Baltimore, and also a representative of the American Advertising Federation of Baltimore. So in this session, we're going to ask Tim to lay out what the ad tax is. Beth will talk a little bit about its effect on businesses who sell advertising, and then I'll round things out by talking about the action steps, what's happened so far, and what you can do to fight this tax. So knowing that we have 50-odd people on the call, I do ask everyone to mute themselves who's not speaking and use the chat function as much as possible for questions. We do have some time reserved at the end. We plan to go for about a half hour to answer questions and for follow-up. And without further ado, Tim, do you want to get started?
Sure. Can you advance the slide, if you would, Rebecca, just so we can do our little legal disclaimer, cover ourselves. I don't think we're going to have a whole lot of legal discussion here, but good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us as we talk through the Maryland digital ad tax. As is sort of customary, as you will see with these webinars, and probably have seen a lot on Zoom over the last several months, I've got to sort of give, as an attorney, the legal disclaimer that which we're discussing today is not particular legal advice, tailored to any particular circumstances. And should you have any legal questions, please consult with your attorney. That is now my CYA. It has been delivered, and we can proceed on to the rest of the presentation, if you will. Do you mind advancing a couple of slides, Rebecca?
I will in just a second. So Tim, that disclaimer reminded me that we are recording this session, and so just be aware of that. It is going to be a private, you'll receive a link to the session after it's over, but just be mindful that we are recording. And now let's
So that's who we are, who you'll be hearing from today. You can go next slide, Rebecca. And those are what we'll run through. And let's set up the next slide, and I will sort of try to run through in very short order, because you're probably pretty familiar with what the digital ad tax is and how it came to be and where it stands. But let's run through that real quick. So by way of background, when we refer to the digital ad tax, we're talking about House Bill 732. That's the legislation at issue. It was initially introduced in the Senate as Senate Bill 2, if you're keeping score, back in January by Senate President Bill Ferguson. The objective behind the digital ad tax from a revenue-raising standpoint was to help fund the mandate of the Kerwin Commission in Maryland. In other words, what you've probably heard of as the Blueprint for Maryland's Future Fund, a multi-year, multi-billion-dollar effort to revamp public schools in Maryland. And lawmakers thought that taxing digital advertising would be one way to raise revenue to fund those education reform efforts. Some estimates, and we would love to know how they came about and would question them, but nonetheless they are out there, and as this bill was scored, it sought to, or it claimed that it could raise about $250 million a year, $250 million a year in revenues toward funding the Kerwin Commission. So that was sort of the background and why it was there from a revenue generation standpoint. In terms of some of the stated policy objectives behind why target digital advertising, Senator Ferguson and others high level made the argument that online entities that profit through the use of and the collection of Maryland residents' data ought to pay some price, ought to pay their fair share. So thinking of the Googles, the Facebooks, big tech, if you will, to put it colloquially. As most folks on this call know and were involved in, first Senate Bill 2, and then as it morphed to House Bill 732, were widely opposed by all manner of the business community. We argued numerous practical deficiencies with it, administrative issues that would come about with it, and of course there are legal infirmities with the law as well. Nonetheless, those efforts, at least through March, fell on deaf ears, and at the end of a very hurried session without a great deal of public input, as everything was shutting down due to COVID in mid-March, the General Assembly did pass House Bill 732 with veto-proof majorities. As it morphed from Senate Bill 32, which was a standalone digital ad tax, and became the legislation that was passed by the legislature, it sort of added from other bills, or I guess I should say the digital ad tax became part of another bill. So House Bill 732 is not only the digital ad tax, it also includes a tobacco tax and a sales and use tax as well. But the part that we're most concerned about, and of course discussing today, is the digital ad tax. And then thankfully, and why we're here today, in May, Governor Hogan did veto the legislation for a number of reasons, but among others on the argument that now is not the right time to be raising taxes as we're in the midst of all the pandemic problems. And that sets up what we're here to talk about today, which is the potential of a veto override. Next slide, please, Rebecca, unless you or Beth wants to jump in with any comments on what I've been saying so far. Excellent. So a little bit more about what House Bill 732 actually is and what it would do. If the veto is overridden and this were to become law, and we're not to suffer from a legal challenge that ultimately defeated it, which we will hope and we'll get to in a little bit, this would be the first in the nation digital ad tax. Maryland would have that dubious distinction. What it aims to do at a high level, it's basically a new gross receipts tax. It's a new tax on annual gross revenues derived from digital advertising services in Maryland. And there are a lot of complexities and questions that go into what all that means and what it would mean if this actually became law. In the legislation, the term digital advertising services, and you can see the quote there, it's defined this way: as advertisement services on a digital interface, including advertisements in the form of banner advertising, search engine advertising, interstitial advertising, and other comparable advertising services. That's at least what the plain language of the legislation says. Next slide, please, Rebecca. The way that this was written, as you probably know, it at least ostensibly was designed to only hit certain companies that hit certain revenue thresholds. As Beth and Rebecca will talk about, we don't believe that's what would happen. We think this would end up being a trickle-down tax that would hit all businesses and frankly, all consumers in Maryland, because of the way the taxes often get passed along, and because we don't believe, this is my editorial comment, that the folks drafting the legislation really understand the very complex nature of the way that digital advertising works and the many players that are involved in digital advertising. It's not a very simple single transaction type of industry. But that editorializing aside, in terms of what the legislation aims to do with respect to who it targets, there are threshold levels that have to be hit before a company is subject to remitting the digital ad tax. And there's sort of a two-pronged test. In order to be subject to paying this tax, to remitting this tax, taxpayer must have $100 million in global annual gross revenues worldwide from all of its businesses. And then it also must have $1 million in annual gross revenues derived from digital advertising services in Maryland. And that is a very tricky and complex part of all of this, determining how digital advertising services take place or are placed, quote unquote, in Maryland. And an initial version of the legislation in part tied that to a user's IP address. That was scrapped in the ultimate legislation, and now the Herculean and very complex task of deciding what would be a digital advertising service in the state is kicked to the comptroller, who would have to write rules and promulgate them about that. That is one area where this law just, in a number of respects, would not, well, let's just say I would not envy the role of having to write those rules, but that's sort of where it is now. And as you saw, if you can go back real quick to the prior slide, Rebecca, sorry about that. There's sort of a graduated scale for this tax, where you get taxed higher the more profitable or the larger your company is on a gross revenues basis. And basically on the assessable base or on your digital advertising service revenues in Maryland, you get taxed anywhere from 2.5% to 10%, depending on your annual gross revenues, as you can see there. Next slide, please. And no worries, I'm close to wrapping up and we'll get to the more interesting stuff. Practical issues, as I was talking about there, how do you determine what the digital advertising services in Maryland are? And then, of course, the comptroller's got this unenvious task of potentially writing rules if, in fact, this becomes law, which we're here to try to prevent. There are, as I mentioned, and I won't go into them, numerous legal issues with this legislation. There are constitutional issues. Particularly, there's a dormant commerce clause issue because arguably this law would be treating out-of-state companies differently and less favorably than in-state companies, and that is a problem under the Constitution. There might also be First Amendment implications with regard to the way that speech is treated or digital advertising, commercial speech is treated, and then there are other statutory problems as well that there are some laws out there that aim to prevent discrimination on basically the digital economy, initially passed back in the late 90s to help spur innovation and the internet. And this legislation, in our view, runs afoul of that. So if it were overridden, there will almost certainly be legal challenges, and when and if it would ever take effect remains very much to be seen. But that is sort of a high-level overview of HB 732, the digital ad tax. And with that, I think, Beth, I will kick it over to you. Oh, I beg your pardon. We'll get to this veto override stuff later. That's Rebecca's part. I apologize for that.
Okay. So this is a very high level and simplistic sort of view from an agency perspective on how it could affect both our clients or small businesses that we service, as well as, you know, us as an advertising agency. A lot of the advertising agencies in Maryland are small businesses themselves. So if a business, like Tim mentioned, if this tax is trickled down to that business, you know, they will have a couple of options on how they want to handle that. I would sort of assume or guess that in a lot of cases, that business would probably reduce this tax amount from their advertising or media budget. I use the 10% range here. So then when they go to their advertising agency and say, here's our budget, here's the campaign we want, it is likely very much reduced from maybe what the original budget was. Now, there are numerous ways an agency can charge a business for that agency's services. One being charging a fee or percentage based on that media budget. If it's now reduced by 10%, that is also taking away the revenue from the advertising agency. When you multiply that out across all of the, you know, Maryland clients that an agency may service, that really makes an impact, and it could be a loss of revenue to the agency. And if there's less media or advertising budget, it's also a reduction of advertising messaging impressions by that small business. So that small business is reaching less people. So a few other implications to think about. Do advertising agencies need to start charging clients more to make up this difference? At the end of the day, though, that solution further puts small businesses at a disadvantage. You know, they're taking it from the tax, and now they need to take it by a, you know, higher fee structure with their agency. Does that even put them out of the round to advertise? I also believe that with clients, it could very well fall on the agencies to educate their clients and these businesses on how this tax affects them, how it affects their business, how it affects their, you know, their advertising campaigns. And that is more time and hours on the agency side. I also believe, I think we're missing it here, but we also have to think about the additional time and money invested in legal and accounting teams. I think both on a business side, but also on an agency side, we would need to make sure, legally that we are accounting for this tax correctly. And I think it would put a great burden, kind of like as Tim mentioned, depending how the regulations are written, I think it could put a really great burden on an agency's accounting team or even, accounting person, depending on how large your agency may be. But I think it puts a very large burden there as well. And then lastly, Tim mentioned this as well, but there really is so much complexity in serving these ads, tracking these ads, what ran in Maryland, what didn't. If a client, an agency is running a campaign that's multi-state, multi-regional, how are you, weeding out what ran in Maryland, what didn't? I think is very complex. As Matt and I were talking, when cookies are being phased out and digital advertising becomes a cookieless environment, I think that becomes even more complicated.
So, Beth, we have a question from the chat on how this would affect small businesses, and I'd like you to see if you can address that briefly. I'll talk about that a little bit more in the action steps as well. But how do you think it will affect small businesses?
Sure. So I think, I can only really speak from an advertising standpoint, but affecting small businesses, if the tax, what Tim alluded to is that Google, Facebook, etc., they're going to pass this tax down. Like they're not going, in theory, they're probably not going to pay for it themselves. They're going to pass it down to the advertiser who could be that small business. So they'll have to take that tax on themselves. So then it trickles then into an agency, because if their budgets are reduced, etc., then an agency fee gets reduced. So I hope that helps answer it, but we're assuming that, and Tim and Rebecca, correct me if I'm speaking not correctly here, but we are assuming that the businesses that the taxpayer, it's going to be trickled down to the small businesses, to those that are running or wanting to do advertising in the state of Maryland.
Thanks. And as Matt says, it will reduce the buying power of a small business. So thank you very much, Beth. Let's get into what we're doing about this. And the threat really is focused on Google and Facebook are creating digital, or that's where people are buying many of their digital ads. And they're not going to just absorb a 10% increase or a 10% tax. That will roll down. So what that ultimately means, as everyone said, is that the cost of advertising will go up. And we know from failed ad taxes in different states that when advertising cost goes up, the amount of advertising in the marketplace goes down, and it slows economic activity. It also hurts the businesses that sell advertising, such as news media, such as agencies, and broadcasters. So our main goal right now is to sustain the veto of House Bill 732. As Tim said, Governor Hogan did veto this legislation. He vetoed it forcefully, saying that it was a bad idea, it was a bad time to do it in COVID, and there is literally nothing that has improved in terms of our outlook in contending with COVID from May to right now. In fact, for many businesses, it's worse. People are still economically disadvantaged. More businesses are on a precarious edge. So in order to sustain the veto,
okay. All right, thanks, Laura.
Could you mute, please, if you're not speaking?
Okay.
It's a multi-pronged effort. So we need to get constituents focused on reaching out to their legislators to say that they do not want this tax. Local businesses need to weigh in. Media needs to weigh in. And one of the coalition that's sprung up around this issue is Marylanders for Tax Fairness, which is made up of businesses and trade groups that are set up to fight the tax. So if we look at the landscape, and here's where it kind of gets down into the nitty-gritty, and I know that these are small words on the page. What you have here is the House floor vote. and the Senate floor vote from the final passage of this legislation. So both the House and the Senate need to have voted on the same exact legislation for it to come into law. So if, and this feels a little bit like a double negative, so those who voted against House Bill 732 do not want the digital ad tax, and those who voted for do want the digital ad tax. So in order in Maryland to override a gubernatorial veto, you need 3/5 of the House and Senate to vote to override. So if we look at the number of no votes in the House and the number of no votes in the Senate, we need to turn 7 House votes from yes to no and 3 Senate votes from yes to no. Because ultimately, if you're kind of keeping score on a napkin, we need 19 senators to vote to sustain a veto and 57 House members. So you can see in the nay votes who is on our side, and you can look on the yes votes to see who we need to try and convert. And I do want to just emphasize a couple things. Senate President Ferguson has made this legislation kind of the centerpiece and first step. He's a new Senate President. Last session was his first as Senate President, and this is really important to him. And so it is a difficult thing for senators to go against the person in control. So it will take an outpouring of outrage and constituent fervor to get people to change their minds. So let's talk about what's been done so far. Marylanders for Tax Fairness, which is something I referenced earlier, is the coalition of business groups, individuals, and small businesses that are working to sustain this veto. You can, and I'll tell you this again in the next slide, but you can certainly get involved with that group. Their website is marylandtaxfairness.org. There's a petition you can sign. The Press Association, AAFB, and the broadcasters have created a joint op-ed that has been distributed to news media yesterday. We hope that will start to come out in publications throughout the weekend. I would also, we've also asked our advertisers we're educating our advertisers on this issue and asking them to take action by reaching out to their legislators and also getting involved with Marylanders for Tax Fairness. Marylanders for Tax Fairness has also created some selected ad spots that explain the issue and are running right now on digital platforms. So what can you do? Because this, and I don't mean to sound so alarmist, but this is a critical issue for the health and survival of our businesses. When advertising costs rise, we all lose, and consumers will be hurt because they will be paying more for consumer goods. Small businesses won't be able to advertise as much, which means they can't grow. And all of our businesses will be adversely affected because we, in many respects, are, even if we're just passing through digital advertising to clients, it means there's less advertising to pass through and the revenues will go down. So 4 things that you can do. You want to sign the petition, marylandtaxfairness.org. Use your network to publicize this issue. If you have the ability to donate some ad space, we have been hearing that the veto overrides may not be taken up in the legislature until February. Normally they're taken up the first day or 2 of session. That seems to be changing a little bit. So think about where you can have the most impact. And most importantly, call and meet with your legislators. After this session, I will send out the talking points that have been developed that you can use. But essentially, when you're talking with your legislator and you want to reach out to the legislator that represents your home and your business, You want to talk from your experience. There's nothing more powerful than saying, this is where I am right now, and this is how I believe this law will affect me. You don't need to get into the esoteric issues of, you know, the constitutionality of something or whatnot if that's not your expertise. All you have to share is your experience. Your legislator represents you, and they need to hear that this is something that you're deathly afraid of, you're worried about, and you think it's going to have a difficult effect on you and your business, your employees, and Maryland. So I want to get into that just a quick second. These legislative meetings, I told you a little bit of what I was going to say here. These are the talking points that we are feeling are going to be helpful for you, and kind of walks you through it. So you want to think through what your business is doing now. What will this do? And always ask your legislator how they are going to vote. So ask them to sustain the veto. And a lot of times they will say, I don't know, I'm still considering it. You want to know what the answer is, because we are keeping score. You know, we need to have those votes turn from yes to no, and it's important to know who we can apply pressure to. And to that effect, your association is here to help and assist you. For Press Association members, I will be on those calls with you if you want. I'm certain that other associations will support their members in the same way. If you need help with talking points or understanding who your legislators are, do reach out, because this is important to all of us. And I think that is, I think we're opening up to questions now. Just kind of running through the chat. I'm hearing, who should we contact to get the ad if we can donate some ad space? Talk to your association. Marylanders for Tax Fairness will develop ads based on your specs. So reach out to your association directly for to get that channel going. And Tim reminds us that we just need 3/5 in each chamber to override. And what other questions do people have?
I think, Rebecca, one thing I would add is just that at this point, and to underscore sort of the urgency of legislators hearing directly from their constituents, particularly smaller businesses who at face value are not hit by this tax because of the dollar thresholds. And there was the great question earlier, like, how does this affect me as a small business, or frankly, me as a consumer in Maryland? And trying to explain that pass down, trickle down impact it's going to have, because I don't think that the lawmakers either understand that or appreciate that. And frankly, they need to hear from those folks, because I think that they are not going to be persuaded by hearing from big tech as to why this is bad for them. That's the intended target here, and the fact that there is this unintended target is the important narrative that I think we want to go with, and the Marylanders for Tax Fairness Coalition, of which all the organizations here are a part, is pushing as well. And just to supplement that, in addition to, ironically, some digital advertising being run by that coalition, they are running spots on some radio stations, I know, in the Baltimore area, and they may be rolling out some spots on television as well in the months to come. But I think that it's important, and anybody else who's been sort of part of the broader coalition, feel free to jump in, to realize that at this point, this is an uphill battle. You know, numerically, we only need to turn a few senators, but based on what I'm hearing, and I think what we're all hearing at this point, while we are hopeful, it's a big lift, and there does not seem to be today the enthusiasm to sustain this veto. And I think if the vote were to happen right now, I fear we would be on the losing end of things. And so to the extent that we can move the needle, we really need to, because this is not necessarily where it needs to be right now, obviously, hence the purpose of this webinar. But I think it's just important for folks to know that that we aren't, well, I'll just speak for me. I'm not today feeling good that the veto is going to be sustained. And I think it's going to take our collective efforts to try to to make that happen.
I do want to just reiterate, Marylanders for Tax Fairness, their website is Maryland, spelled out, taxfairness.org. That's a great way to, if you want to add your logo to that coalition. They are also developing a petition, which has, I believe, over 3,500 signatures right now, and will continue to grow. So you'll be hearing more and more from your association about this. We just wanted to make sure everyone was on the same page about sort of being educated on the issue and talking about what needs to happen next. Any other questions? All right, well, at 10:33, thank you guys so much for spending the time with us. And do reach out if you have any other questions. We'll be in touch as well.